jacket.
Okay, so we are live. So welcome everyone. We've got many time zones. So obviously Tim Smith, Melbourne, Andrew Percy, London, Henry Ergus, Paris. We've got Zvi, Eckstein, Tel Aviv, Sanjeev Sablok, and myself, Melbourne. So we are all set. So tonight we are going to see the post-COVID economy, and I would like, before we start debating, I've prepared a couple of little snippets for us to have a look at. This is, by the way, a little bit of a continuation of the first COVID that we had 2 days ago, the first COVID subject, which was on the lockdowns, whether it was a policy blunder or necessary evil. And obviously, there are consequences, economic consequences, which we are here tonight, wherever your time zone is, to actually analyze. But in doing so, I would like to share my screen and to show you a couple of little videos. It's going to be a total of less than 3 minutes. If I am able to find them, let's see. Okay, in any order, let's try this. Okay, so the first one happened not very long ago at the WHO conference. There was a journalist who asked a question, and you'll hear the question, and then I'll let you hear the answer.
I can hear you. Hopefully you can hear me. Yes. I was wondering, as cases rise and restrictions come back or increase in many places, what can the WHO tell us about what it has observed about the broader impact of lockdowns or semi-lockdowns on people's health? And I'm thinking about the sedentary lifestyle, the diet, tobacco use that comes with many people's interpretation of staying inside. Thank you very much.
Just really follow up on just maybe in the way in which you posed the question, because I think it's important. You said as cases come back and restrictions come back. These are not absolutely equivalent. There are many countries in which cases have come back and through a mixture of intensified surveillance and increased community empowerment and participation, that can be kept under control. What we want to try and avoid, and sometimes it's unavoidable, we accept that. But what we want to try and avoid are these massive lockdowns that are so punishing to communities, to everything else. So we don't want to flip from no cases, everything's open, a few cases, everything shuts down again, because that's exactly the sort of scenario that we want to try and avoid. What we really need to focus on is ensuring that as cases come back, and they will and do come back, and this virus is clearly showing that it's got a lot of life left in it. The vast majority of people in the world are still susceptible to the disease. And we need to make sure that we're also focusing not just on restrictive measures, but on the surveillance, on the testing, on the tracking, on community empowerment, on education, on everybody taking their responsibility, the community, their responsibility, and the government, their responsibility. And that we try, in as much as possible, to minimize the broader effects in society through large-scale, complete national shutdowns. This may be unavoidable where the disease has got out of control again, but we shouldn't accept that in every country, the return of cases should be seen with an immediate return of the need for lockdown restrictions at the national level. There are many things that can be done between those 2 points, and we should make every effort to do so in order to keep our social, economic lives open, and particularly schools and other vital services.
So there you go. That's the first one. I actually keep the other one up my sleeve. We'll play it a little bit later. But let me with those opening remarks by the WHO, and now establishing that if that is the official body that provides the medical advice to all governments around the world that are members of the WHO, Australia and the UK are certainly, and Israel are part of WHO. I've been searching for an answer because I have never been able to find what the medical advice is for those governments. When they say we follow medical advice, they never showed what that means. And WHO actually is clear in saying that lockdown should be avoided. So having that as a background, I would like to first invite Henry Jurges to do his opening remarks. Henry.
Thank you, Albert. Just to be clear, and also for the benefit of the other panelists, the way I had interpreted our brief was really to look at what we thought would happen as economies come out of this period and what the issues are in dealing with that. Is that a sensible way?
That is fair, but there's the broader issue, which is what is the damage, first of all? I mean, when you want to solve a problem, you need to know what the problem is. And let's start with that. What happened here? We were in lockdown, we smashed the economy. What's the damage?
Well, I mean, it seems to me that essentially what happened was we put large parts of economic activity into a kind of deep freeze, and that deep freeze had a range of consequences which will play themselves out over time. So on the one hand, during that period, households essentially strengthened their balance sheets in aggregate. So even though some people were worse off, by and large, government transfers plus the fact that people weren't spending as much as they usually do, and that most people remained employed, meant that household balance sheets actually, on aggregate, improved, and domestic savings or household savings rose. So that will play itself out as economies reopen, in the sense that what we would expect is household spending to rise as households make up for lost time. The flip side of that have, however, been a series of developments which raise quite serious concerns going forward. And essentially those developments are, to my mind, just putting them in headline terms, the following. So the first is that corporate balance sheets, particularly of small and medium-sized businesses, weakened, and they weakened substantially. And there's a very real risk that once government assistance begins to be withdrawn and guaranteed loans come due, that we will see a wave of corporate bankruptcies, which will also put pressure on banks. The second worrying development is that government balance sheets everywhere deteriorated very markedly. Tax revenues fell, spending greatly increased, understandably so, but nonetheless, the result of that has been a spectacular increase in public debt. And the consequences of that debt and its manageability going forward are another big question, because what we already saw in this crisis was that it was essentially governments like Australia, which came into it with very strong fiscal balance sheets, that were able to cushion the impact of the shock on households. There will be more shocks in the future of whatever type, but governments will have to address those shocks with greatly weakened balance sheets. The third development, which looms or hangs over all this, is a prolonged period of greatly eased monetary policy, monetization of public debt by central banks, and zero or negative real interest rates. Again, whether that can continue is questionable. What happens when it starts to reverse is a very major issue going forward. Finally, of course, what we've seen building up over this period is the mounting geopolitical tensions, which also have very significant economic consequences. And so what happens to the international trading system and how that affects the recovery is the final really big question in my mind. So why don't I leave it at that, Albert?
Okay, for a start. And I'd like to invite Zvi Eckstein.
Well, I prepared a presentation, but maybe if you want to save time, I can just tell you what it is. So I want to say there is one big issue is because this is a pandemic which become the worst global recession or depression, if you want, since World War II. And certainly, as I think was said, one issue that will come up is how we coordinate in the future, worldwide and national war, or if you want, a way to deal with these kind of things, and how Western economy can follow the Taiwanese and South Korea method of minimizing the economic impact and minimizing the spread. And this is what we call the TTT policy. I think this is a big issue that has to be dealt with the World Health Organization and each nation. And the key problem in the Western economy is the issue of privacy. The privacy versus the public health and the public economic impact. Now, my prediction is very much, I think, what Henry said. GDP, we are going, when the vaccine is going to be used next year, like all OECD and IMF, we are going to see sort of a V going up. I mean, basically, I believe that almost half of the decrease in GDP in all the countries in the Euro area, in the US, Israel, UK, and even more in Australia, almost 2/3 of the decrease is going to come back on next year, mainly through the employment. As the vaccine comes in and people come back to their activities, we are going to see an increase that in Australia is like 3%, next year UK is maybe 6%, but went down much more before, etc. In Israel, maybe 4%. However, from that to come back to potential output loss, remember that each of these countries has a potential output growth of between 1 to 3 and something percent, then that will take about 5 years, meaning until 2025, just to close the potential gap. IMF talk about this, all projections are there, and that means that we are going to see a central bank policy with asset purchase in the ECB, in England, in the US, in Israel, everywhere, maybe even in Australia, continue for until 2025. That means that we are going to have a short-term central bank interest rate target that is very close to zero, and inflation above 1%, maybe 2%, maybe even higher in 2 years from now. That means that we have negative real rates in the short term, medium term, and 3 years, and even 10 year could be, as it is now, a negative interest rates. And that would help a lot to control the increasing debt to GDP. The increased debt to GDP across country is a huge variance. US is going to reach 50%, 150% of GDP. Israel is probably going to reach something around the 80% while Australia is probably going to be the only one below 50%. But all of the debt relative to GDP increases almost at the same rate. However, the levels are very high, and the key tax that is going to pay the debt is going to be the negative real interest rate, basically inflation. The outcome, and that's I want to say my prediction, the outcome is going to be a more devastating outcome than what we have predicted as we thought that we are going back. I think GDP growth per capita is going to be between 0.5% to above 1%, and there will be a divergence across countries. Those countries that will have a more investment focused policies and increase in certainty and lower, like Australia and others, may have a higher growth rate than other countries. And then I want to emphasize that a huge increase in inequality. I would predict that in the next 5-6 years, GDP per household on the lower 20% would go down, or at the best will be zero on average for the last 5 years. And most of the growth rate on household income will be on the upper 20%. And therefore, inequality in the Western world will go higher, and I will explain why. The key why is that there is a wide divergence in the ability of cooperation to deal with this crisis, and the digital technology and AI and what we call skill bias technology, those are going to grow quite substantially, more than what we expected before the crisis. And therefore, the high human capital individuals and families would gain more from the tinier growth rate that we are going to see. And therefore, I think this is the key challenge. So the two key challenges for Western world is the low growth rates. That will be divergence across poverty rates will go up and inequality will go up in almost all AI countries, more in countries like US and Israel maybe than Australia and UK. But I would say this is a big issue that if we would not pay attention to the families on the lower 20-30% of the distribution, it may generate the next social crisis. And the other issue that I think is really what I said at the beginning, the coordination on health policy, not only within countries, but also worldwide. Privacy versus public health is a big issue. We don't hear you, Albert.
I forgot to press my space bar. So Zvi, thank you very much for your presentation. We have 3 economists on the panel, so I would like to call on our third one, that's Sanjeev Sablok. Sanjeev, can you hear me?
Sanjeev, you are on mute.
You are on mute, Sanjeev.
I know. Yeah, sorry about that. Sorry. Yeah. Can you hear me now? Yes. So Albert, we are facing a man-made crisis, and I sort of want to, start with that rather blunt statement. It's not a COVID, or it's not a health crisis. It's a man-made crisis that will only end when governments get back to following the spirit and letter of the laws. At the Tuesday's panel on COVID-19 lockdowns, I showed that lockdowns can never be justified for a flu-like virus. They've not even been suitable for Ebola. So for a flu-like virus, they're actually prohibited under the science and the laws. And that international border closures can only be justified for a very short duration. I also showed on Tuesday that annual mortality data from Sweden for 2020 is telling us very clearly that this pandemic has been in the range of a bad flu. there has to be a signature of the pandemic in the total mortality, and Sweden, where it's sort of ripped through the country, we're not seeing any significant, really dramatically significant increase in deaths. Those who missed my observations on Tuesday could consider reading my book, The Great Hysteria and the Broken State, and my 68,000 word complaint to the International Criminal Court, which is available on my personal blog. The disproportionate and unjustified policies we have seen in 2020 have caused an enormous range of harms. I have listed these in my complaint to the International Criminal Court. Particularly relevant for our panel today is the September 2020 report from the Institute of Public Affairs in Melbourne, which found that the cost of trying to eliminate the coronavirus from Australia is more than the annual government spending on defense, education, health, and social security combined. It said that the elimination strategy that is being pursued by state and federal governments will cost $319 billion. That's equivalent to 23% of the GDP. In particular, our politicians have driven Victoria into a ditch. Victoria has lost its AAA rating with Standard & Poor's, and Moody's is reviewing its rating as we speak. This might not be a big deal in today's low interest rate environment, but it does signal very poor governance capability in the government. And taken along with Daniel Andrews' refusal to abandon the Belt and Road Initiative and his tendency to help union mates and thus his party, investors are likely to think twice about putting their money into Victoria. And we're also likely to experience a steep reduction in population growth. Many Victorians, I'm aware, who've been talking on social media, were quite shell-shocked by Andrews' brutal lockdowns, curfews, and mandatory mask mandates. They are looking to relocate, and I hear the state of New South Wales are often being mentioned. Many international students have also been put off by Australia's policies. Scott Morrison has ruthlessly separated the families of hundreds, if not thousands, of Indian students. Many of them have written to me expressing their pain. These students and their parents have lost tens of thousands of dollars, and their families have undergone the mental agony of forcible separation. It sometimes feels to me like Victoria is at the moment a kind of a sinking ship. It will need a visionary government for Victoria to recover. First and foremost, the economy must be reopened immediately, and I mean immediately today, and we should all revert to the pre-COVID normal. This will include opening international borders and resuming normal life, along with some voluntary hand washing and protection of the elderly, just like we do during a bad flu season, no more. As I said earlier, there is no evidence that this pandemic has actually killed more people than a bad flu would do in a particular year. Second, the government should not try to stimulate the economy by pouring money into infrastructure. That's something that's going on in Victoria, and I strongly oppose that, because that will only crowd out private investment, which is very scarce. And because of the skills gap involved, it will not even help the unemployed who have lost jobs in the tourism, education, and hospitality industries. Instead, the government should sharply cut taxes, particularly for the retail, tourism, and hospitality sectors. Third, the government should slash regulatory burdens to boost housing demand. The current planning system adds hundreds of thousands of dollars to the cost of an average Melbourne home. One way to cut housing costs will be to put a 3-year moratorium on planning and building regulations, or to simply revert to the status that prevailed 15 years ago when regulation was much less onerous. The shape of the Melbourne CBD is likely to change as many people choose to continue to work from home in the post-COVID world. The regulatory system must facilitate, not obstruct, this change. In this regard, I believe that the Planning Act must be urgently reviewed from first principles to make it market responsive and performance-based. By the way, this is an area where I specialize in the Treasury, and I've got a lot of opinions on the Planning Act reform. And the government must end its climate obsession. The IPCC's reports are very clear that at worst, the climate change might reduce future income from 450% to 434% by 2100. So what's the problem? To be 4.34 times richer in 2100 instead of being 4.5 times richer, why are we bothered today about the future generations who will be at least 4 times richer than us? Most importantly, though, I want to conclude by mentioning that there needs to be a complete radical review of our systems to make sure that we do not get this kind of hysteria ever again. I have made many suggestions for institutional legal changes in my book in the last chapter, I think, couple of chapters. The most important, in my view, is to establish a parliamentary officer whom I call the Black Hat Commissioner, whose job will be to look critically at every policy and to provide independent opinion to the people of Victoria. Had such a role existed, in my view, Albert, this COVID hysteria would have not lasted even 1 month. Thank you very much.
I'm
Albert.
sorry, I keep on forgetting. This is not a good system. Let me just undo my microphone. And there we go. Then I don't have to think about the space bar anymore. Yes, we have two policymakers with us, one from the UK, one from Melbourne, Australia. That's Tim Smith. Sorry, Tim, before I forgot to say that you are also in Melbourne with Sanjeev and myself. But I'll ask, first of all, Andrew Percy to address us.
Thank you, Albert. Now, well done on getting all of this organised this year. I know it's been a real challenge, but we'd all, much as I think John Speller said the other day, prefer to be doing this from the King David, but I'm doing it from my kitchen here in Yorkshire. But look, as you rightly pointed out, and I'm pleased you did, I'm not an economist. I can't say I've agreed with everything I've heard up to now, but as I say, I will defer to the economists on the panel and their greater knowledge on those issues. I think from policymakers' point of view, for people like Tim and myself who are politicians who have to decide how we move forward from this, I suppose there's some important questions coming forward. I suppose the first is how much of what we've seen, I mean, well, first of all, I should say, you know, the UK being a very service-driven economy has been the worst impacted by these measures that have been, in my view, necessary, but in many cases and in other cases unnecessary. We've had the biggest drop in the G7, and I think as we move forward, the question for, let's say, policymakers is how much of what we've seen happening in the last few months here is permanent. How much of it has sped up what were already trends occurring in the economy? So the increased movement of business online, the digital nature of working, what concerns many of us, particularly people like me who represent small towns, is the how much the death of the high street, which is quite important for a lot of our local economies, has been sped up, how permanent that is. And of course, what the impact here has been good for the gig economy, which of course is something which gives a lot of policymakers some concern, because I think it was Zivi who talked about a rise in inequality. Well, we know those who are working in the gig economy, of course, have much less stability in their work lives, much less ability to plan for the future. But a constituency like mine, which very much relies on all of that, actually saw unemployment fall in the last month on month, because we're home to a huge number of distribution centres and logistics centres, all of which, as I say, are largely gig economy jobs. So how much of that is permanent? And if that is a permanent shift, how do we address that? So in some ways, you could say the virus has sped much of that up, but I think in others, there has been a reversal of trends. So I hear people increasingly questioning globalization. I hear the phrase that's used a lot is we've gone from just in time to just in case. The need for local supply chains has become much more important. This reduction in the movement of peoples. I mean, I think it's been particularly tough for you guys in Australia. I think you're not allowed out the country at the moment. We've at least still been able to travel. But, you know, this is the first time in my young life that, you know, the actual movements of people internationally across borders has receded. And the question, of course, will be how permanent is that? I read a study the other day which was very depressing on this, suggesting it could be a more permanent feature than perhaps many of us are hoping for. So what do we do to move forward? I don't think I necessarily agree with Sanjeev in terms of the lack of necessity for government intervention. I think now is the time for government intervention. I mean, we were elected here a year ago, almost to the day, on a platform of levelling up, particularly in constituencies such as mine in the north of England. So the concerns around inequality in my mind, prove more than ever the need for that investment in communities such as mine and those around here to ensure that inequality that could be driven wider by the pandemic is abated as much as possible. So look, there are some big issues for policymakers. I think until we get a better sense of how permanent some of these changes are, whether they have simply, I mean, I read a lot about how towns and cities are going to have to restructure. I would just end by saying I've noticed quite a significant change in people's mindset from the first lockdown here, which occurred in an unusually warm English or British summer and spring, where people seem quite content with working from home, and it is estimated about 40% of jobs could be done in the UK could be done from home. And I've seen a big shift in people's views on that, particularly into our second lockdown, which has taken place, of course, in the British autumn, where I now have people saying this is, we've got to get people back to work. I want to be back in the office. So I'm not as convinced yet that this shift away from offices and away from city centres, which seemed a very popular option, as I say, in the first lockdown in the spring and summer, is going to be all that permanent.
Thank you, Andrew. Tim, your time.
Well, Albert, thank you so much for the invitation to speak this evening, and can I wish everyone on the call a happy Hanukkah. First night of Hanukkah in Australia tonight.
Absolutely, that's remiss of me. I should have done that before. Absolutely.
And my Hebrew is woeful, so I won't even attempt it. But I would be delighted if we were at the King David. I think it would be a wonderful evening, and I can't wait to get back to Israel very soon. I've had many trips there over the years, and it's a great spot. And we've always stood very firm with Israel on my side of politics, particularly in Victoria. And I'm currently not in Victoria, Albert. I have fled north for freedom. I'm in the wonderful city of Sydney this evening.
Okay. Very good.
And I have the reason why, for those of you who are on the call who are not in Australia, is that my state of Victoria, like the UK, had a second lockdown that went on for 4 months that was entirely unnecessary. And to Sanjeev, can I thank you? And I've been meaning to reach out to you, sir, for some months, which I've failed to do. But can I thank you for your very principled resignation from the Victorian government at the height of the lockdown? Sanjeev was an economist in the Department of Treasury in the state government of Victoria, and he sensationally resigned when we had the most draconian measures that have not existed, to the best of my knowledge, in any English-speaking jurisdiction, particularly a common law jurisdiction, where we had a curfew at 8 p.m. Andrew, you'll be interested to know, at the height of our winter, we were locked inside for 22 hours a day. We were only allowed outside to go for essential items, to go to work, but only for essential workers. Only an hour or 2 hours of exercise in the end. It was police state stuff, as Sanjeev called it out quite correctly. I'm a shadow minister in the opposition here in Victoria. Albert and I obviously have had many discussions over the last 5 or 6 months about the fact that Victoria's second lockdown was caused entirely by a failure of the state government to manage hotel quarantine. So for Zvi and Andrew on the call, the states are responsible in Australia for managing external arrivals to the country. In every state of Australia, the Australian Defence Force, the local police and private security were utilised to manage compulsory quarantine in hotels for 2 weeks. In every other state of Australia, that process was managed pretty well. There were a few glitches here and there, but by and large, it worked pretty well. But in Victoria, the Andrews Labor government, which for Andrews' interest, frankly, makes Neil Kinnock look centrist, they completely stuffed it up because of an ideological obsession in refusing the use of the army and in deciding to use private security, but private security that decided to employ those who are most disadvantaged in our community. So we didn't even have top quality trained private security. We basically had those who had been in the unemployment queues months, unemployed, untrained, except for diversity training, I might add, but no training around hygiene control. no training around the really technical aspects of shifting literally thousands of people from the airport into essentially prison. Let's call it for what it is. It's prison for 2 weeks in a hotel room, and absolutely no oversight of those private security guards. And what happened? Well, of course, those who essentially had a prison stay at Her Majesty's pleasure attempted to get out. They attempted to bribe the security guards with various things. And of course, some of the security guards acquiesced. And in one famous case, one lady desperately wanted to go shopping, wanted some fresh air, and was taken to the Hugo Boss store in Collins Street, Melbourne, where she promptly spread coronavirus to 10 of the staff. This resulted in the second wave of COVID-19 in Victoria that resulted in 801 people losing their lives, and Victoria's death rate, if you took Victoria on its own, took out the rest of Australia, only 900 people died in Australia, 801 of them are in my state. You compared that death rate to the number of people that live in Victoria, which is 6 million, Victoria's death rate per head of population is actually pretty bad. So we have an inquiry underway here in Victoria. Well, I'm not in Victoria, but back in Victoria. And I think that's it's a show trial, essentially. It's not a royal commission. It's a board of inquiry. And it's basically a show trial that will probably get the Premier off. And I know Alan Howe's here tonight, and Alan's done a wonderful job at the Australian prosecuting this case over many months. And I think it's going to be an absolute tragedy for the people of Victoria that those who are responsible for the second wave of COVID won't face the music. Just so you're aware, the Secretary of the Premier's Department resigned for misleading the inquiry, as did the Health Minister, as did the permanent head of the Department of Health. Now, I know that this discussion's on the economy. I just wanted to, for those who are not in Australia, paint the picture that Australia looks comparatively, from international standards, to have done a good job. But in my state, in Melbourne, it's been an absolute disaster, where we have literally returned to the dark ages with regards to a total abuse of our personal freedoms because of government failure. And Tony Abbott has written this, and I, to be frank, totally agree with him. When we were having 700, 800 new cases a day, as we were in August, the government didn't really have much of a choice given how badly they'd stuffed it up. My criticism is that the lockdown went on for so long, and there were certain aspects of it that were deliberately designed to scare the hell out of people. People were genuinely terrorised because the government wished to deflect from their own failings. For example, a curfew. Well, the Israelis know this better than anyone. You only have a curfew in wartime. Well, we're not at war. We just had a state government that completely stuffed up hotel quarantine that allowed the virus back out of the community. That curfew was designed to scare the hell out of people. And frankly, it worked because 40% of Victorians don't blame the state government for the second wave. Now, you might ask, what's the effect been on the economy for a 4-month lockdown that the rest of the country didn't have? Well, it's cost 200,000 Victorians their jobs. It's cost the national economy billions upon billions of extra dollars. It's cost 60, as you might know, and there have been previous discussions over this dialogue over previous nights, but our government is paying people essentially their wages at the moment through a program called JobKeeper, which is going to end in March. 60% of those recipients are in Victoria now, and that is only likely to rise. I came to Sydney this afternoon, and Sydney is basically back to normal. I'm happy to report to those in Melbourne. People are packed into the pubs, they're packed into restaurants, there's traffic jams at rush hour, and for our international friends, Melbourne is still like a ghost town. So how do we rebuild the second largest city in Australia that is largely, like the UK, a services-based economy? It's got a large property sector, a large financial sector, a large professional services sector. Well, none of the workers are back in the office yet. We've still only got 50% of private sector workers back in the office, or that's only going to happen, sorry, I correct myself, that's only going to happen in January. The public service is still at home. All of them, still at home. So Sanjeev was talking about the property sector. I actually agree with him. I think we've got to take the shackles off, particularly in central Melbourne, and get some real investment back into the CBD. There's a couple of planning amendments that the Labor Party brought in to stop high-rise development back in 2015. If I was planning minister, I would get rid of that tomorrow. I've told Albert that many times. I would get rid of that planning amendment called C270. I would get rid of that tomorrow to stimulate high-rise development in the centre of Melbourne. But the advice that I've had, and I'd be really interested to hear from the economists on this call, the advice that I've had is because interest rates are so low, demand in the property market hasn't, well, it's gone down obviously, but it hasn't gone down nearly as much as everyone was expecting. There is still actually quite a degree of transfers in property. And the advice that I've received is that's going to continue because banks are going to continue to lend. The federal government has actually essentially liberalised lending laws in Australia in recent times. That will stimulate further lending. Obviously, with the borders being closed, population growth and demand from that perspective will be nil next year. But from what I can see, particularly in the part of Melbourne that I represent, Andrew and Zavi, which is a relatively wealthy part of Melbourne, it's not entirely different. I'm the member for Kew, Andrew, and it's not very different to Kew in England, I must say. We're still seeing property transfers at levels. Obviously, they're not like last year or the year before, but they're not nearly as weak as I thought they'd be. So with interest rates being as low as they are, with borrowings going to continue to increase, I think the property sector, well, the advice I've had is that the property sector, despite JobKeeper coming off in March, will actually firm up. And I'd be really interested to hear from the economists on this call about that, because obviously as the Shadow Minister for Planning in the second largest state in the nation, I've got quite an interest in these matters. And on that note, I will be quiet.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. So yes, thanks for all your remarks. I mean, I would urge people to watch the video that we recorded 2 days ago on the COVID-19, about the lockdowns. So I don't want to necessarily repeat myself or revisit that. So we are really to think about what are the permanent changes that are going to happen as a result of whatever happened, and the blames, let's say, they will fall wherever they will fall, but the situation is as it is. The difference between New South Wales and Victoria is the confidence. The confidence, obviously, Tim, has to come from government. And so if you were, for instance, to take away that state of emergency we're under at the moment, that would do something to restore a bit of confidence. Insofar as the property market, as you know, that's my profession. I'm in the property market. It's a large sector, property market, mate. When you're talking about price being stable, it depends what sector you're talking about in the property market. I can tell you that in the apartment market, it has been fairly smashed. In the hotels, it has been fairly smashed. So what are we talking about? Maybe good houses in Kew and things like that. Maybe that's still on the stable side, although we have seen a curve. It's down 10, 15%. In the apartment sector, I can tell you it's down anywhere between 20 and 40%. And I know because I see valuations coming through. And the big question is, what will be the bank's reaction to all of this within the next 3 months, once we're outside of the legislation that's protecting, if you want, people not paying rent and not being evicted up until the end of March, come 1st of April. What happens? There are other regulations in Australia, such as APRA. APRA requires that the banks all keep a certain standard as far as their debt to equity ratio. Once this is unadjusted, they have to readjust it. What does that mean? That means they have to call for loans. They have to call for margins. And who's giving you the margin? I mean, you can only get another loan if you have another property that is free of mortgage. So the mortgage market is the largest sector in the Australian economy. I don't tell you anything new, right? And that is the sector that can produce a serious consequence in Australia. I don't think quite frankly, I don't think that no government in Australia has thought through what the consequences are once you touch that market. I know Henry and I had several discussions on this, and Henry, I know that you're very familiar with this, so I'm going to ask you to comment further on that. Henry?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Albert. Well, those were very interesting insights from all of the panelists, and there certainly isn't time to address them at all properly, but starting with the question you just raised, Albert, I see that as part of a broader complex of issues, which is really the deterioration in corporate balance sheets, which has occurred to differing extents in different countries, and also differs both by sector and by size of company. But what we've seen, certainly in the European economies, is that many governments reacted to the lockdown by extending either low interest loans or by guaranteeing bank loans and to businesses that were adversely affected. And one of the interesting features of that is that the more fiscally constrained governments were in terms of coming into the crisis with higher ratios of debt to GDP, public debt to GDP, the greater the degree to which they relied on indirect instruments such as contingent loans or low interest loans, rather than actually cash disbursements. So, for instance, the French government, the Italian government, the Spaniards, all relied primarily on this form of indirect support as far as small and medium-sized businesses were concerned. And the consequence of that is that in broad parts of these economies, we are coming out of this crisis with the company sector having itself a much higher ratio of debt to income. And that will create at least two sets of concerns. First, that there are fundamental issues of solvency that will arise. And as those fundamental issues of solvency arise, that will put pressure on the banks. And then the second set of concerns is that many of these entities will face liquidity difficulties going forward, which is really the point Albert has just made. And those liquidity issues will, at best, hamper growth, at worst, will lead to, will transform into fundamental problems of solvency, compounding the solvency problems which already exist. In that environment, I don't think simply having very low official interest rates or asset purchases by central banks will suffice to prevent serious difficulties, because ultimately these are issues where banks will be facing the risk of non-performing loans and will be required by the regulations that really came out of the global financial crisis to address that. So that is a big overhang issue that will weigh on what happens to growth going forward. There are lots of other issues that will weigh on, I think, on growth going forward, including the overall rise in public debt to GDP, the difficulty of trying to scale back some of the emergency spending that was undertaken in the context of the immediate response. But let me just address for a moment, very quickly, 2 points. The first point was the point Zvi raised about inequality. And there, I'm not so sure that I agree, in the sense that if you look at what drove the increase in inequality over the period really from the late 1980s to the global financial crisis, a large part of that was the entry of this huge labor force, the Chinese labor force, into world markets. Well, that's essentially going into reverse, partly because of demographic trends in China, partly because of, unfortunately, growing trade barriers. And so to that extent, at least, that is to the extent to which that was a significant factor, increasing inequality in the advanced economies, we'll see that trend potentially, if not reversing, at least the growth in inequality dramatically slowly. The second point I'd just like to touch on for a moment is how many of the changes and adaptations that we saw in the lockdown are likely to persist. And there, I'm not horribly well placed to make an informed assessment, but my impression at least is that some of that change will stick in terms of working from home, but possibly not all that much of it. And the reason to my mind is that it's one thing to shift to working from home when you have an established labor force that is familiar with business routines and where you can simply transfer what was already working day to day in an office setting into a remote working setting. But as the workforce turns over, as people retire and new people are recruited, I think it becomes increasingly difficult to manage that without having some kind of unified presence in a workplace that will allow you to handle change, introduce new ways of doing things, adjust to shocks, and so on and so forth. So my own sense is that of that change, which is probably not the greatest, but one of the very significant changes that came out of the lockdown, there we'll see that going into reverse. What we may not see going into reverse to anywhere near the same extent is the growth in online sales and online distribution. And that, I think, will have very significant implications for the shape of our cities, for our transport networks, and for the way the retail sector works.
Thank you. And Henry, yes, go ahead, Zvi.
I would very brief. I mean, our time is over. I mean,
My
analysis.
Is not over, Zvi, to be clear. I know that the first session is always saying the time is over after 55 minutes, but not the second nor the third. So we've got a bit more time, don't worry.
Okay. So I think Henry and I probably disagree on the main source of the inequality. Mostly it is the what we think is the skill bias technical change, not the Chinese. The Chinese is an important issue, but that's not the main source of what has been going on. Is that the income of the high-skilled people has been going up much faster than the low-skilled people. And what we have seen, and look at the prices of Amazon, look at what's going on in the stock market, look at the digital economy, this is all high skill. Now the pandemic hit both on illness, both on poverty, both on everything, both on unemployment, both on income that lower 20-25% of the population, all advanced countries. And in Israel, it is almost there, and they're young. Now we face an economy where the growth is going to be very high in all the industries, in finance, in marketing, in cyber, in social media, everywhere there, in the large companies. Their monopoly power has been increased, and Western economies don't know how to deal with Google and Facebook and all that stuff. And monopoly rents has been increased, and there has been, you can read the papers by Philippon at NYU and everywhere. And I can see that given the situation, and those guys, their debt is not a problem at all. The key debt problem are the small businesses, the services, the tourism, the restaurants that are going to collapse and so forth. Who is working there?
Exactly.
Therefore, in the next 5 years, I'm not predicting in 250. I'm predicting the next 5-6 years. We are going to see an increase in the inequality in all advanced countries in different degrees, depends on how countries deal with it. And I don't know what the Biden administration is going actually to do. I know that in Israel, I have a plan how to do it, but it doesn't seem the government function at all on these issues. Some other countries doing better. So I see that as a very important issue. And I want to say that there's a former central banker and very close to what's going on in Israel. I'm not extremely familiar in what's going on everywhere. But if I say Canada has a very long tradition of a very good regulation on banks. US has a long tradition of bad regulation on banks, but it has changed dramatically after this crisis. The banking and the financial banking sectors entered to this crisis in a much better situation than any previous crises. Their capital stock, etc. The second thing is government and central bank are willing to put both tax money and printing money. And the public is willing to hold the cash, which give them a negative interest rate of 1 to 2%. And therefore, companies that will come back to action. So the main question is, what would happen to the industries that were shut down completely almost, the tourism and restaurants and other gathering activities, when the vaccine is going to be spread. And what we see is actually to my bit surprise. I expected what we see this month would happen in March. Since it's happening now, and maybe in most countries, about 90% of the population would be vaccinated by June or even before. And the question is, what would happen to those companies and how the governments will react? I agree that there will be much more debt, but look, we are in a new world. The 10-year yield, which is a key variable to any present value calculation of any firm and any debt and any stocks, is 1% or less. When inflation expectation for 10 years is 2 or 1.5. If that's going to continue with the existing Lagarde policies in Europe with a negative interest rate, and Jay Powell and given the Biden in the US, and certainly the UK bank, and look, Australia, you are in the best situation with all the mistakes you make on the health issues in terms of the economic policies. You are the best in terms of debt to GDP, in terms of growth rate, in terms of population growth, etc. Look, the growth rate's going down because we are observing in the following: the population growth rates are down, people get older, human capital increase in the population is down, and female participation is ceased to exist. So that took about all those aspects take from per capita growth rates about 1%. But overall in Australia, you're doing better. Your population growth is 1.5. Your economy is relatively in a good situation. So I ended up here. There is some disagreement. I don't see a big threat on solvency on the corporation.
Okay, there is one point that you've raised and that I would like to illustrate, and that's the point of inequality. I'd like to play you that second video that I was skipping for the right time. I think this is the right time. So this is Justin Trudeau This is a speech he made a couple of weeks ago. Am I showing you the right one?
Yep.
Yeah?
Yep.
I'm afraid not. Let me stop this again. Let me try again. Hope I can do this. That is, no, that's the wrong one. Let me close this one. This is Justin Trudeau. I've taken a little bit of his speech. I didn't take it out of context. You can watch, I invite you to watch the whole speech. It's on YouTube.
This pandemic has provided an opportunity for a reset. This is our chance to accelerate our pre-pandemic efforts to reimagine economic systems that actually address global challenges like extreme poverty, inequality, and climate change.
So, get out of this. So it was a very interesting speech because he's been basically talking, the way I understood about what he was saying is that it sounded a little bit socialistic in my view, the way he was looking at the redistribution basically. So he was mixing that also with climate change. So there are those obviously leaders in the Western world, after all, Canada is one of the Five Eyes, that are looking at this as an opportunity for something much greater, the Great Reset. No, it's not a conspiracy theory. Justin Trudeau is talking about it. Henry, have you heard about this?
There is certainly a notion that is being articulated in many fora that says that government strategies as we come out of this crisis ought to be directed to bringing economies onto a new type of growth path in at least continental Europe, but also I think this is true in the UK. There's a lot of emphasis on the notion of a green recovery, whatever that means, and it's very likely that we'll see similar rhetoric in the US, and of course in Canada. That's been a theme of the Trudeau administration, at least in terms of its public positioning, for some time. So in and of itself, the notion that the recovery paths will be different, I think, is one that's really quite well established. Whether it will translate into very much concretely, I think is an entirely different question. First of all, the constraints on governments will remain very tight in terms of it's taking some time for unemployment rates to come down. Governments will still face significant fiscal constraints, despite the factors V was rightly pointing to in terms of the willingness of central banks to essentially undertake large-scale asset purchases of, particularly of public debt. Even so, they will face fiscal constraints and want to try to improve their balance sheet positions. And additionally, the geopolitical tensions will continue to weigh on public decision-making, and they will tell against, I think, any great or enduring improvement in international cooperation, at least in the next few years. On the contrary, what we're seeing at the moment is much greater centrifugal forces, both economically and geopolitically, and I don't think that's likely to change. Nothing is likely to alter that path. If anything, they may become greater, in which case this will be very much a rerun of what happened in the global financial crisis, where world leaders such as Kevin Rudd in Australia, Sarkozy in France, Gordon Brown in the UK, and Obama in the US, all said that the global financial crisis would lead to a new kind of growth path. But of course, absolutely nothing came of that.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. I would like to call on Alan Howe to see what sort of questions have you collected.
Okay, Albert, we've got a few. I wonder if I could ask Sanjeev, given that Henry's been pretty busy there for the last half hour. Sanjeev, Andrew Percy mentioned when he was speaking about how we've discovered, unfortunately, that the supply chains are a bit fragile and we're a bit vulnerable. And we're also vulnerable to pressure because of that. And we've seen some of that pressure coming on Australia, particularly from China in the last 6 weeks. But how practical and achievable is it for countries like the UK and Australia to take greater control of their supply chains? And indeed, if you'd listen to the former leader of the opposition, Bill Shorten in Australia, return to manufacturing things that we stopped doing years ago?
That's a really interesting question. In fact, I'm personally very interested in that because of the interaction between India and China. So I pay a lot of attention to India, where actually I'm a leader of a liberal political party. And the aggressiveness of China has caused a great amount of rethinking. I've been a complete unilateral, no tariff person the whole of my life. That means I would never, ever imagine any restriction in any trade situation. But I think there has come a point in time that we do need to think maybe not very aggressively at this stage, and particularly not for Australia, where there has been just a lot of talk. But China has actually physically killed Indian soldiers. And that has caused a very kind of an irreparable damage, in my view, to the relationship with China for potentially many decades to come. And that means a country like India, by the way, has the capacity, which is one of the big things that's going for India, to reframe its internal political and economic system to move into the kind of space that China at one time occupied or has occupied till recently. We see countries like Vietnam, we see countries like Bangladesh and many others taking on a role at the bottom end of the tier of where China becomes more expensive, so they go on to produce in Vietnam. And I think that's the kind of thing we should see potentially in a country like India. And if that were the case, I really don't see any possibility of that low-cost manufacturing that you get in Bunnings, $2 little gadget or whatever. I see no possibility of that being produced in Australia at anywhere close to that $2 price. But there is a strong possibility of that having, being produced in India or being produced in Pakistan or Bangladesh and so on. So there are, and Africa, by the way, let's not forget that Africa has been doing pretty well in many parts of Africa. And so I think there's a need for, there was a time when Richard Nixon went into China to engage with them for the first time, which then led to the kind of, engagement, openness, which led to finally the WTO participation by China, and then this big boom that Henry has spoken about, which led to the dramatic shift in wages. Well, there are these arbitrage opportunities right now as we speak, and I think the world needs to, and there are 3 countries participating in this dialogue. I think this is a very serious question. I think there's an opportunity for countries, I have no idea of the forums, but I think there's an opportunity for countries to actually actively explore supporting, the China was supported at one stage. American companies went and invested. I think there's an opportunity for a kind of interaction with these other developing countries where the wages are extraordinarily low and where people will be benefited enormously, by the way, if we were to go and try to develop them in their skills and other things. So I think that's the kind of a summary of my answer, that I think there's a potential need that's emerging. For India, it's absolutely urgent. I would, from my political party side, I've been very critical of China, and I've been critical of Modi. And I'm a very small guy. We are a very small fry in India, a very small party, but we do have a particular viewpoint. And that's a very libertarian viewpoint, we call it. And we're totally pro-trade. So I would want trade without tariffs with anybody. But with China, I think the supply chain issue has come in a big way with the medical supplies and so on this time in the pandemic. We've been caught unawares. We were not prepared. Things might go bad anytime. We are seeing a lot of tensions in Australia at the moment with China, but things could go bad anytime. I really think the time has come for the world to really reset. I'm not using the word reset in the manner that was earlier suggested or conceptualized, but the reset in terms of shifting its energy to the poor, who are really, really poor. There are hundreds of millions of them who have not been adequately skilled. And can we potentially collaborate for mutual benefit so that we still get the $2 thing, gadget in Bunnings, but it's no longer produced in China where we become kind of a hostage.
Very good.
Okay. Zvi Eckstein, I wonder if I can ask you a question. Australia has famously or possibly infamously called for an inquiry into the source of the coronavirus. I don't know why. Wuhan, wet market, that'll do me. But might it not be more important especially with the economists on this panel, wouldn't it be much more important for Australia to call for an international economic and health investigation of everybody's response to this pandemic? What worked, what didn't, and what were the costs of the things that worked? And then at the end of that, we'll have a set of measures by which to approach the next pandemic.
Thank you for the question. I think this pandemic has been very interesting in the following sense. 3 countries made the preparation for the pandemic. It was Taiwan, South Korea, and Finland. And not only that they were prepared, they even execute the preparation, how to deal with the pandemic from day one. And when you look at the data, both in terms of the the number of people that were become sick, the cases as we call them in the data, and then we look at the numbers of death, and we look at the number of hospitalization, but most important, if we look at the data relating to the decrease in GDP, these 3 countries have the lowest on each dimension in far way for at least Q1 and Q3, and maybe the prediction of IMF for the year and next year. And what they implement is what I read in the literature, the standard view on what is called TTT, test, track, trace, and implement it. And the main reason that it was not implemented in other countries is first, they were not, they didn't prepare it. And second, if they try to implement it, then the point that we cannot force people to do certain things, because there is if you want to get sick, it's fine. And it's okay that you are basically have the externality on other people. And basically what we have in the Western world is we have a crazy responses of lockout, because people are doing what we call as an economist moral hazard and privacy about their sickness, and generated together with, you may call it stupid government, you can call it stupid lockouts, and certainly there are if you cannot implement what I call the TTT policy. And this policy also has to be coordinated, because people cross countries, New Zealand, which was very close, the way they reacted, they just closed the country and immediately lock out everything. So what I want to emphasize is that first, the World Health Organization was wrong in the way it traced the beginning of the pandemic. the coordination among nations on how to prevent affecting each countries in terms of movement, etc., is not there. And then I think the issue of privacy. Is it right that we are can generate death rate? Now, whether death rate was higher than general flu, it's different by countries and depends on the health system in each country. But overall, Israel, for example, until June, the death rate from March to June was extremely low. Now it's about 10% than usual. What I want to emphasize is that we realize that this issue of potential pandemics of viruses is a real threat for the wealth of the whole world. And certainly government has to sit together and work on it. And it is not different than the issue of environment.
Okay.
It's even more important in the short run than the environment. It needs an international coordination for the well-being of the people. And I want to emphasize again the inequality. The pandemic affected, this pandemic, unlike the Spanish flu, this pandemic killed mainly people at 65 and above and poor. And those who were not taken care of, they were in elderly homes, which were not well protected by their government, mostly. The flu, the Spanish flu hit the young 100 years ago. If we want a better world to live in, we should find ways to think about how to deal with it. And I think all countries, we have to force all countries on certain rules and force. I mean,
unfortunately, our capital time is melting. Our capital time is going away, but I think that
I'm done. I'm sorry.
We heard your point very well.
Okay,
I'd like now to ask each and every one of you to give us your parting comment, no more than 1 minute, please. Let's do it in reverse order, and I'd like to start therefore with Tim Smith.
Well, thanks, Albert, and it's been a fascinating conversation. If I could respond to some of the comments that Zvi just made. Look, I suspect if there were millions of soldiers being demobilized right this second, fatigued with all sorts of different injuries and the like, this disease would afflict them not dissimilarly to the way the Spanish flu did. Obviously, the Spanish flu was far more virulent than COVID-19, but you would have a similar result in much younger people if the world's conditions were that at the end of a world war, like it was 100 years ago. And the point that we mustn't forget is that this disease does afflict those who are most vulnerable in our community, which means policymakers should spend their time protecting those who are most vulnerable, i.e. people who have comorbidities or who are elderly, and frankly, let the rest of us get back to work. And that would be my message to the Victorian government and indeed the federal government. And the federal government here in Australia has basically taken that view, despite the fact that they are not responsible for the public health response on the ground. So as Tony Abbott said the other night, we can't spend 2021 under the doona, or the duvet, as they say in England. So I just hope that we can realise with a vaccine on its way that's been rolled out in the UK now, and congratulations to the Boris Johnson government in the UK and to the Conservative Party for getting that out and about.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you, Albert. Sorry, I was going on.
That's all right. Andrew Percy.
Thank you. Look, I think it's been an interesting discussion. I think in defence of government, I can only speak from here in the UK. We have not had the same level of enforcement of the measures that you've seen in some. We haven't had people locked up in hotels. People have still been able to travel, and we've tried to maintain personal liberty as much as possible. I do think I get a bit nervous when I hear people comparing it to the flu. The excess deaths in the UK are well above that, and there are tens of thousands of people dead in the UK who would otherwise have been alive, including people I know, including one of my local councillors in the area who had, decade and a half, maybe 2 decades of their lives still left to live and were in any other measure fit and healthy. So I think that we have to give governments some leeway on this. It's been incredibly difficult and challenging to respond to, particularly in a country as population dense as the UK, where, you know, all the international travel that comes through here. It's why I think comparisons with other countries, particularly, you know, comparing the UK with Finland is not a good comparison because of the very, very significant differences. So look, I think, you know, I just think it's been an incredible period for governments. I think governments have clambered to do generally the best they can. What matters now is how we progress from here. We've got the vaccine being rolled out, including just about half a mile from me here. The question is, you know, where do policymakers go next, as I said in my introductory comments? And I think that's less clear. I think turning off some of the measures, I just leave on the final thought, I suppose, would be around these measures. I can't see a situation in the future in the UK where, when we have another economic downturn, we don't end up with the same demands as we've had now, which would be for a furlough scheme, for a self-employed support scheme, you know, significant grants of business. It's very hard to say, well, we'll do it when there's a pandemic, but when there's in another economic crisis, you can all go and hang. And I don't think any government in the UK will be able to do that again.
Thank you, Andrew. Sanjeev, can you do it in 30 seconds?
All right. So I think the general point I want to make, a couple of points. The planning for pandemics has actually been out there in the open for the last many, many decades. Every country had a plan, and the only country that actually followed the plan was Sweden. I do not agree with intrusive policies that are followed in some Southeast Asian nations that have been mentioned. I actually they are actually also scientifically inappropriate in the long run. So that's as far as the planning. I've got all this stuff, by the way, in great detail in my 68,000 word criminal complaint to the criminal court. There's a lot of detail in that about all these plans. About the Andrew's point about UK's excess deaths, I know that the BBC had mentioned 70,000 a few days ago, and I think the answer to that is that I've actually given that answer to Peter Hitchens, and he and I are having a discussion on this, and I've sort of and with a couple of professors from the London School of Economics. The idea here is that a lot of these deaths, the 70,000, were actually deaths caused by the lockdowns. These are the deaths that I call crimes against humanity, which I've complained to the International Criminal Court. So there needs to be a methodology. I'm preparing a paper which I'll publish on my Times of India blog, a longish paper on how we can actually disaggregate the actual deaths which took place from the COVID virus from these excess deaths that actually were caused by the lockdowns. That's all I think. Thank you.
Zvi.
I spoke enough. I'm okay. I
You're
think
okay?
I can.
You don't want to give some parting remarks?
Well, I think I said everything I could.
Fair enough.
Actually.
Thank you for your participation.
I had enough time.
Thank you for your participations. We really appreciate that. Henry, your guest.
Just one remark, which is this, Albert, because it involves someone who's been a great supporter of the dialogue and a very frequent participant in the dialogue, is that one of the reasons Australia actually did reasonably well, I think, were the efforts of Tony Abbott when he was the health minister to significantly increase pandemic preparedness, and not only to increase the planning in the abstract, but also Tony, as health minister, was the first health minister to insist on having live fire tests of pandemic preparedness so as to see how well the system worked at each level of implementation. One thing that has really come out of this pandemic is that what makes governments different from each other is not merely their capacity to strategize and to plan in the abstract, but their capacity to implement. And if our capacity to implement, with the notable exception of Victoria, was reasonably good, it wasn't fantastic, but it was reasonably good and better than most, I would say, a large part of the credit in the public health space should go to the excellent work that Tony did and his unflagging commitment to the notion that we had to be prepared for pandemics of exactly this type.
Thank you, Henry.
And now, Bear,
All
can I
of
just
you-
say, I must buy Sanjeev's book.
Oh, you must, absolutely. I'm grateful to all of you. Thank you. That was a great debate. And we have to rush because we've got the next session